Good evening. I'm Dr. Paula Celeste Gomes-Naversa. I'm the faculty director of the Vredemans Portuguese American Archives, and I'm also director of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture. Today's lecture is being live streamed, and I would like to take a moment to welcome those that have joined us here in person, and also welcome those who have joined us virtually from around the globe. We will be taking questions from those who are physically in attendance today at the conclusion of the talk. And I ask, once again, I remind everyone that because we're live streaming, if you have a question at the end of the talk, you need to use the microphones that are here on either side of me, because that's the only way that the people that are here virtually will actually be able to hear your question. I now have the distinction of introducing our newest endowed chair, Dr. Eric Morier-Genoud. Dr. Morier-Genoud is a graduate of the State University of New York at Binghamton, where he completed his PhD on the politics of the Roman Catholic Church in colonial Mozambique. He spent the next 6 years as a research and teaching fellow at the universities of Oxford, Lausanne, and Basel. He is currently an associate professor in African and Imperial history at Queen's University, Belfast, and is a leader in the field of social movements within the context of Lusophone Africa. During his residency here at UMass Dartmouth, Dr. Morier-Genoud is teaching a graduate seminar titled Armed Conflicts and Movements in Portuguese-Speaking Africa. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Morier-Genoud.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this introduction, Dr. Paula Noversa. Thank you to the Center for Portuguese Studies for first of residency, I suppose, and for this opportunity tonight to talk about this topic. I'd like to thank also the International Student and Scholar Center and Daniel Pierre-Bougadagov in particular, who co-host this event today. So I am going to talk to you today about, let me get a PowerPoint going actually, the latest conflict, I suppose, in Mozambique. That should be it. Here is the cover. Yep, that's perfect. Okay, so the title of the talk is about jihadism in Mozambique. And I'm going to talk to you about this topic, which is in effect the latest conflict in Mozambique. Mozambique has suffered the liberation war. It had a civil war which followed in the 2010s. There was a resurgence of civil war, and now this new conflict emerged in 2017, and it is still unfolding as we speak. It is a topic which has garnered a lot of interest because it is also the first jihadi conflict in Southern Africa. There hasn't been any before, and this is raising a lot of alarm in Southern Africa among all states of the region, but also the international community. So there's a lot of interest in the topic, and there is, as I will let you know in a minute, quite a bit of debate as to exactly what is going on. Today, I'll talk to you in 3 steps, as the original subtitle was indicating. I'll start by telling you where this conflict comes from and what it is. In a second step, I'll tell you a little bit about what the situation is today and how the government is trying to stem this insurrection. And I'll conclude then with some comments on where I think the situation is going or may be going. It is a topic which I have researched in 2018 and 19 in Cabo Delgado itself, short visits, but then I had organized a team to do some research for me and with me. So we managed to do some field work, quite original one, I gather. And this eventually led me to write an article. And today I'm using basically the article and updating with the latest developments. I thought not being too sure who the audience was, I thought I might start with a quick description of where Mozambique is, where Cabo Delgado is, and where the conflict is actually unfolding. So on the left, the biggest map is, of course, Southern Africa, and you can see where Mozambique stands at the right, at the bottom of it, just above South Africa, which you have here at the bottom. So the Southeast Africa coast, I suppose. And Cabo Delgado, where the conflict is unfolding, is at the very top of Mozambique, the 11th province. Okay. Sure. Yep. Okay. So I gather that those on Zoom did not see the map, so apologies for that. But the two first maps are pretty straightforward. The second one in the middle had the point that Cabo Delgado, where the conflict is unfolding, is at the extreme north of Mozambique. The capital is in Maputo, which is at the bottom of the map. It is 2,500 kilometers between the two. It has importance not only because it is very far from the capital, but Cabo Delgado is actually the north of Mozambique, which is mostly Muslim, and it is on the border with Tanzania. And people in Cabo Delgado will tend to travel more easily to Tanzania than actually going to the province, to the capital city of Maputo. So you get an idea of the dimension, I suppose, of Mozambique and the dimension of the conflict, which is actually fairly small. It is one province out of 11 in a country with 10, because 11 is capital. On the right, a map from The Economist, looking at the violent event in 2020 and 21. And what you can see is where the action, military action, is taking place is actually on the coast. So half of the province of Cabo Delgado on the coast, which is ethnically fairly specific. I might come back to that. But this is where so far, after 4 years, the conflict has remained contained. You will notice on the map that I have a, I'm not sure how well you would see that, but there is a field, gas fields, which have been developed over the last couple of years, which are really important, and are important also because some people reckon this is why the insurgency emerged. I'll come back to that. But just actually symmetrically, the insurgency developed actually exactly facing where the gas finds have been made in the 2000 and developed from 2010. And this gas, LNG gas discoveries have led to major investments. Actually, the biggest private investment in Africa, right? So it is really a mega investment which is taking place. The French and Americans and all sorts of interests developed a platform, an energy platform that they were building until it was suspended last year, which is worth 20 billion. There's other platform offshore, etc. So we're talking in a nature of tens of billions being invested in the area. And of course, this has consequences, whether it is the origin of the conflict or it shapes it is a matter of debate, but it is really important, and I'll come back to that. So 2 points, I suppose, is the particular nature of the area where the conflict is taking place and the relationship or possible relationship to the gas. Third, I should say, the fact that the province of Cabo Delgado, of course, borders, as I said, Tanzania. Okay, so the subtitle of the talk was about where is this insurgency coming from? And the truth is the insurgency started 4 years ago, and there has been a lot of debates because there's a lot of interest in the insurgency, a lot of concern, as I was telling you, from politicians, from states, from journalists, and from civil society and academics. Debates have focused largely over the question of the cause of the insurgency and the nature of the insurgency, with a minor debate, very minor debate over the name of the insurgency. Is it an insurgency? Are they bandits? Are they called Al-Shabaab? Are they called something else? I'll come back to that. But I would reduce the debate in some ways to three facets, which I think are important to discuss and will give you an idea of what we're talking about, as well as what is behind this insurgency. So the first element is in relation to Islam, is that an Islamic or Islamist insurgency, and this has been debated from the very first day the insurgency started. A lot of Muslim leaders and the government for quite a while said, well, this has nothing to do with Islam. The insurgent may be using Islamic images, shouting Allah Akbar when they make attacks, but this is not Islam. This is not even deviation. This is just banditry, claiming to be Muslim to cover their track. Others have been, and I'm among those, claiming that it may be unorthodox Islam, it might be wrong Islam, maybe incorrect, etc., but it has something to do with Islam. It has something to do not only in the language they use and the symbols they use, but it emerged within the Muslim community. So you may call it heterodox, you may call it wrong, etc., but I think there is a connection there which needs to be explored. So I'll come back to that in a moment. The third debate is about the cause of the insurgency, and this is probably the biggest debate. Why do we have an insurgency, and what caused it? So very quickly, people, journalists and politicians had an answer before very often the research began, and poverty was the easy option, easy explanation, I should say. Cabo Delgado is the poorest province, or the second poorest province in Mozambique, and the area where the insurgency began is an area particularly poor. Poverty is quite rife, and I think it is over 50%. If you use the UN criteria, 50% of the population. So this is an important factor. Another element which has been flagged or raised as an explanation was that youth in Cabo Delgado felt marginalized and therefore took up arms. And this is an explanation which is still very solid, and a lot of policies are being developed to cater to youth in Cabo Delgado to try to prevent more extremism and more violence. So these explanations have translated into policy, or can translate to policies. So it's not just a theoretical debate. We're talking of very concrete things. And it is true that the majority of the fighters of the insurgency are young. Actually, there is but now also children involved, etc. This is whether this is the only reason, I think, is not the case. And can we just characterize it as a youth rebellion? I don't think so. It is poverty, it is youth, it is also a rural sector of Mozambique. Another explanation for the cause relates to the gas, precisely. The gas arrived, as you saw in the map earlier on, and developed in the exact same area. And a lot of people thought, well, billions are being poured in this area. People are poor. Well, that's pretty obvious. They took up arms and are fighting for a cause. It's unclear. The gas was discovered before the insurgency, but hasn't really begun to be exploited. So there's an issue there as to exactly the role of the gas. And my argument would be more that the development of gas shapes insurgency, but probably was not at the origin of the insurgency. But it is an important element, and you could see it in a map early on. The last cause I will note, which has been spelled out by a lot of people in Mozambique and politicians, pretty high-powered politician, is that it is a conspiracy. Mozambique just got gas at long last. There's a prospect of raising billions, making billions for the state, developing the country, and here come some bandits destroying everything. And the conspiracy is, of course, very attractive. I'm a great fan of conspiracy theory, except until you try to pin it down, and then it becomes more complicated. There's a series of conspiracies raised. So one would say that it is foreign countries, without really saying who. Somebody said it's CIA, somebody said it's Qatar, others said it's Tanzania because they're trying to develop their gas the other side and they're late. Others say it's just evil people, I suppose, etc. There's a internal conspiracy whereby the president comes from this area of the country and it's probably a way of undermining his legitimacy, etc. And again, these elements may be valid, not valid, but they do shape policy. And I think it has shaped, in this case, the policy of the government. My own view over these causes is it's actually probably not exclusive. I think they're all valid. A colleague of mine, David Matzin, had a very nice metaphor to explain, saying, well, the situation in Cabo Delgado was very problematic. There's an issue of governance, poverty, youth marginalization, the gas coming up, raising expectation. And then what it was, he says, is it's a dry field, and these jihadists came along and just lit a match and it just exploded, right? And I think probably this is what it is, because one of the questions is, why did it start in Cabo Delgado and not in another province? There is another province which is poorer, there's other areas which are poor, there's other areas where you have youth problems, etc. So why there? And I think the key to me, and hopefully to him, is that the jihadi established himself in that area. Related to that, and I'll stop there, but it gives you, as I say, kind of framework and an idea of the causes and the nature of the insurgency, is the question of whether it is an external or an internal problem. Is it Mozambican who became jihadists because they became influenced by ideas of Islamist war against the secular state in Mozambique? Or is it actually foreigners who came from Somalia down to Kenya, where they waged a war, then down to Tanzania, and then they were pushed off by the Tanzania forces over the border, and then the war started in Mozambique? As often with these kind of debates, it's the issue of the egg and the chicken, which came first. I think the two go together, if only because the Mozambicans, and I'm the adept that it started as a Mozambican affair, but they were influenced by foreign ideas, by foreigners. They went abroad. So you can't really unpack the two totally and say it is only one thing or only the other. So I was telling you that I did a research project in 2018, then 2019. And the reason was that I had an interest in armed conflict, as some of our students know, but I had done work on Islam as well in the 2000s, and I stopped eventually because I did not know Arabic, and I thought that to do proper work, I really needed to invest massively. And I had another project which was about the Catholic Church, etc. So I stopped. But then the insurgency began, and there was a lot of I thought, wrong or irrational explanation as to what was going on. And I started intervening in a newspaper piece, and then another one. Then I thought I should maybe go and look for myself. So I did a research trip in 2018 where things became very clear, and I thought, well, then I need to do some more research, and that's what I did in 2019. As I said, I had a team with me, so other people whose name I have not made public to protect them. This situation is still not very easy, so I thought that was safer. There was a lot of speculation, I was telling you, a lot of theories used, and very often these theories were the one you find in all conflicts among theorists, precisely, of wars for profit, these kind of discussion, and they were plugged on the situation of Mozambique. And I thought, well, we're discussing what is happening before we started the research. So what we need to do really is, to my view, is find out where the insurgency started, and that is Mocimboa da Praia. This is a reason of this photograph of a map. Find out who were the attackers, right? We have images, there's journalist reports of who were the attackers, where they came from. Were they foreigners? Were they Mozambicans? And then try to figure out what they wanted. They did speak during the 2 days when they did their very first attack. So that was my point of departure. And from there, I figured out what was happening, and then I built up a research project. And the findings I made, which are published, is that the insurgency has the name of Al-Shabaab. That is how they are known and how they are referring themselves as. And Al-Shabaab is the name of the insurgency, of course, in Somalia. So it's not a neutral name, of course, but it is also the name of the youth in Arabic, right? So it's not only a reference to Somalia, it is also a reference to their own youth. Another name which is used is Ansar al-Sunnah, which I think is very problematic, but this is a name that insurgents tried to use at the very beginning. So we figured out who they were, and myself and my team went to do some interviews and a bit of research in areas of the country, of the province of Cabo Delgado, where they had been, but they were not fighting the war. So we did a series of interviews with the police. We managed to get some paperwork, etc. And it became very clear, and in fact, most people in the province of Cabo Delgado were very clear that what was behind the insurgency was a sect, a religious sect, in the sociological sense of the term. But newspapers, actually, before 2017, were referring to this sect as a sect, the sect of Al-Shabaab. So there were news items in the newspaper. And as a sect, it is a group which basically decided to separate themselves from society or withdraw from society to practice their own religious beliefs. They had, excuse me, what you call an Islamist agenda, trying to live under Sharia rule, and they decided to withdraw from society, set up their own mosque, their own villages, if you want, or set of houses. And they taught their children Islamic religion only. They prohibited children to go to school. They prohibited everybody actually to mix with society, to engage with the police, to engage with the justice system, engage even with the medical services. They had to reject that society to live a pure religious, a return to the origin, if you want, of Islam. The photograph here, the top one is in Balama, a district in the south of Cabo Delgado, where I suspect, though I'm still not 100% sure, that the sect may have started. This is the earliest date we have, in 2007, so 10 years before the conflict began. And a man came from Tanzania, a Mozambican, who had lived a series of years in Tanzania, and he set up a mosque and entered in conflict with the other Muslim because he had another reading of Islam and of the Quran. He rejected state official, he rejected anybody who did not believe as he did. And he set up his mosque and then had people, followers, build a house around him. And this was where the mosque stood. And in 2012, he was expelled by the authorities because he was creating too much trouble, and the population or the police destroyed the mosque. Below is a photograph of the wife of the leader in another district whom we interviewed. And the photograph is by the back. I think she doesn't want to be too well known for that reason, but she lived with a man who set up the sect in that district. And she told us about how it operated, how it began. And he was imprisoned in 2015 and eventually died in prison in 2017, a long story. But we got bits and pieces of a story, and we could thereafter bring together a narrative, I suppose, about what the sect really wanted, which is live under Sharia rule and not live under a secular state as it operates at the moment in Mozambique. And I managed to actually design a map, which came in my article, of where the sect was present. And the stars are where the sect was present. The white stars is where they were expelled from. So the state expelled them because, I'll come back to that. And the map had to be changed a bit because colleagues of mine discovered that the sect had actually a presence in the province of Nampula, which we didn't know, and in the province of Nyasa. So it was actually wider than I had uncovered. So the research is still ongoing, and we are adapting the map as it goes, I suppose. The sect operated on its own, separate from society, as I was telling you, separate from the state. And it grew quite successfully. As you can see, it started opening mosques all over the province. And as it gained power, I gather that they actually radicalized. We started seeing from around 2015 instances where they decided, the SEG decided that, well, they were living in a place called Mukojo in this instance, where they were selling alcohol, and they thought, well, alcohol is not adequate, is haram, is prohibited, and we have withdrawn, but we don't accept it. So they tried to close down the places where they were selling alcohol. That led to violence. Another place, it was about school. They tried to close the school. So they started actually, rather than withdrawing, they started trying to intervene in society and change society. And that led to violence in a series of instances, and it led to repression. Other Muslims were unhappy, of course, with the sect, which they thought was totally heterodox and not possibly Muslim, misbehaving. They were wearing shoes in the mosque. They were having bald heads. They had trousers cut. They were doing a lot of things wrong for most Muslims. So innovating might be the other way to see it. So there was a repression which came on the part of the state, on the part from other Muslim organizations, and they were radicalizing. And this led in 2016, I gather, maybe 2015, to them actually shifting the way they thought or they were planning. Rather than withdrawing from society, they decided that they couldn't continue as it is. They needed to attack the state, to change the state, wage a religious war to establish an Islamic state in Mozambique, or at least in that area where they were. So they trained, and they trained with a local policeman who joined them. They trained also with Tanzanians who were brought from Tanzania to help them design, organize, and train militarily to wage the attack in 2017. So there, this trans-border aspect came into play very clearly. Now, the conflict began in October 2017. The government was taken by surprise. Nobody was really expecting, but it is the government in Maputo, in the capital, who really did not see it. And most academics, me included, who had just not followed things properly. So it was a shock. They attacked the city of Mocimboa da Praia. They took control of the town. And they actually mostly stole armament, which kind of tells you something about the lack of preparation. They did not have enough arms. So they stole armament, and then they fought with the government. Then the government forces pushed them out of the town, and they fled in the forest and started waging a war. The war was, in the first year, very low-key. It was attacking very usually at night, attacking villages, houses, and they would destroy the houses and kill those they deemed were infidels who were not following the Quran properly, Christians as well, of course, and they decapitated them. So there was a lot of extreme violence, and they were gruesome. It was more than decapitation, but I won't go into that conversation, I think, for tonight. The conflict grew slowly. They started gaining confidence, and they started attacking in new areas, and they started attacking during the day as well. Things changed in 2019 dramatically, because as the insurgency grew slowly, they actually suddenly attacked district capital cities or towns which were quite significant and took control of them. The picture on the top is Kisanga, which is a district headquarters. More importantly, they took control of this city of Mocimboa da Praia, which has an airport, very important for the gas development, and has a port which was designed and was being remodeled precisely to develop the gas. And they took control of the city for a day, and then they returned a few months later and stayed another day, and then stayed longer. So suddenly the game was changing. This little insurgency was starting to gain really importance. And it did so militarily on the ground, but it did so also symbolically in 2019, because the Islamic State declared that the insurgency pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, and the Islamic State had agreed to their joining the Islamic State. So these are the two pictures at the bottom. So the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, right, waging a war beyond in Africa and West Africa, but this is now a war they're waging in East Africa. So you have the flag of the Islamic State, and the picture on the left at the bottom is actually the ceremony to renew the pledge to the Islamic State. And this is an image which the Islamic State disseminated, basically saying we accepted it and here's a proof, right? And this changed the game in the sense that suddenly the Islamic State is involved. So there's a big debate as to the involvement of the Islamic State in Mozambique. Some people say, well, it is the Islamic State and it has always been. I would argue they're connected. And there's a very nice argument by colleagues of mine who say the Islamic State, a bit like Al-Qaeda, operate as a franchise. So they give titles when they show that you proceed, you're a good Muslim, you want to do jihad properly, etc., then they accept you. And then they give you advice, maybe a bit of money, but they give you advice, training. They may send 1 or 2 men to help out. And I think that's what the situation is, though some people say that there was a huge influx of ISIS fighters, and others say it's all bogus, it's just a few images. If you believe, you're stupid. Go and figure, but I think it's more than that. The Islamic State has been producing information which at the beginning was very imprecise, and over the years, it has become, over the years, 2 years, I suppose, has become ever more precise in the location and producing images which demonstrate that they have a connection, they get the images, and they get them very quick. At the beginning, they would announce an attack a week later, and they usually get the names of villages wrong. They were saying it was south, it was north, etc. Now they're very precise and they know exactly what is going on. And I think there's an understanding amongst most analysts that the Islamic State is now involved. There are major attacks which demonstrated, in the view of military analysts, that there had been tools and tactics which led them to succeed in attacking major towns. So the Islamic State is now one of the names of the insurgency as well. And the American government inscribed Al-Shabaab as a terrorist organization. That was this year, if I'm not mistaken. And they called it ISIS Mozambique, which is not what the Islamic State says. They say it is a Central Africa province because there's another insurgency in the Congo. And they want to claim that the 2 insurgencies connected to them create this big province in all the Central Africa. In reality, they're 2 very small insurgencies. And we have seen now images of documents from the Mozambicans, which says ISIS Mozambique. So maybe there is a province of Mozambique there in the making. So let me shift to the government. You know, it takes 2 to dance, and it takes 2 to wage a war, of course, or to resist a war, I suppose, in this case. The Mozambican government, I was telling you at the beginning, has been taken aback. They were not prepared. They did not prepare for this insurgency, and the government in Maputo did not see it coming and did not organize much. There were some men who were imprisoned, but they did not foresee that this would turn into an insurgency. In fact, there's a series of people, including the governor of Cabo Delgado, who argued that this was a religious issue as a sect, and we should not intervene in their affair. And they did not see that it would turn into a violent event. So the war has been going on now for 4 years, and I think it's worth thinking about where it's unfolding. I showed you a map, but also what consequences it has. And there's a difference for waging the war as an insurgency. You attack wherever you want and disappear. You just need to feed yourself. And a government who has to manage the whole territory and has to deal with refugees, has to deal with destruction, rebuild it, etc., etc. So at the moment, we are talking around 3,500 people killed, according to ACLED, which is an organization counting from media the people died. Who died, which is biased because it is out of newspapers, and there's very rarely information about soldiers being killed, and there's hardly ever information of people killed in the bush or in the forest, right? So we're probably missing, I would say, half of the people dead. So we probably double that number. Equally important is that as of August, this is the Office of the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs of the UN, which is the reference. They produce these graphs regularly and produce all the information about a humanitarian situation. And in August, they were saying that there were 731,000 people who had been displaced already by the war. And at the bottom, you can see the graph, and most of the refugees were actually displaced in 2020, so after the taking of these district capital. What you see in the map then is the intensity of the humanitarian situation, people moving around. And what you can see is actually what is a conflict only in half a province of Cabo Delgado is actually impacting another two provinces, Niassa on the left and Nampula in the south, where they have to receive refugees, they have to cater for them with the UN, but they still have to deal with a much bigger problem than just a small conflict which may be contained, but produces a lot of refugees, produces a lot of destruction, and produces needs to actually feed this refugee who can't do agriculture, etc. So it has become actually a major problem for the government at present, and it is also one because there's a lot of international worry, as I was telling you. In the very first year of the conflict, the government did not really understand what was going on, and they thought it was a small problem. So they thought it was mostly bandits. They called them actually evildoers. That was the official term to be used. And they thought they were just a bunch of crazy people who will eventually be caught or disappear. And it was, of course, above all, an internal problem. Nothing anybody should put their nose into. And they sent the police. And you have a picture at the top of police force, which is actually has a mechanical, if that's a proper term, but they have trucks. These are BTR or personal carriers, which are pretty heavy, I suppose, to fight a guerrilla. But this is how they fought the guerrilla in the first years. So they sent police force with some success, but not that many, because the insurgents were, as all insurgencies and all guerrilla, in the forest, disappearing, making quick attack at night and disappearing in the day. The insurgency, I told you earlier on, grew, and it grew in 2019 in particular, right? And it grew with the attack of district capital, I was telling you, and then symbolically with that connection with ISIS. And this is when the government started realizing they need to change their game. So they did, and what they did in 2019 is that they hired mercenaries. The first group they hired in September 2019 is the Wagner Group, which some of you might know, might not know, which is a Russian group, which is very tied to the Kremlin. The Kremlin says it has nothing to do with them, it's private, but most analysts reckon it is semi-official organization. They moved in September, and within 2 months they were gone. They don't seem to have been very well prepared, and they have problem articulating with the army and the police. It's not very clear, and it's a wholly secret affair. We don't have any image of the Russian on the ground, or I don't, at least. So they stayed there 2 months, and then they left, and partly I think because some of the men were beheaded, and they were, as I was saying, disagreement with the officials, police, Mozambican police and army. So the Mozambican government then went to hire the DIC Advisory Group, which is DAG, which is a South African outfit, people who were doing some security work in game park in Mozambique, and who were very trustworthy, or who were trusted by the government. And they came with a series of helicopters, 5, if I'm not mistaken, old helicopters, so a bit of on the cheap, as some people would say. That's the picture at the top of the helicopter, which is an Alouette, an old French helicopter. And they fixed on it some guns and bombs, etc. And they, what they did, in effect, is give the Mozambican government aerial supremacy, which they did not have. The Mozambican army had been largely dismantled at the end of the civil war, and it hadn't been rebuilt. So they had, excuse me, very few planes, and I think only 1 helicopter. So the South African came specifically to fight the insurgents. The problem, if I may say so, is that insurgents knew how to respond, and they built underground tunnel on their bases. We have images of that now, that some bases were caught, and they operated at night when the helicopter can't see anything. So they adapted and they kept on fighting with some success. In fact, quite a significant success in that in Christmas 2019, they managed to attack the LNG base, which everybody wondered whether that was what they really wanted to do. So they managed to do a tiny attack in the perimeter of this construction, and that raised all sorts of alarm. The Mozambican government said, no, we'll keep it under control, no panic. But then in March, the insurgent did not attack the LNG, but they attacked the town next to it in Palma, where most of the foreign workers were housed, and they took control of the town for quite a few days. And the foreigners then were being chased. Some have been killed. We don't have the numbers. And that hit the media big time. So the English TV, American TV, everybody was on the affair. And that created panic for the Mozambican government, but above all for the gas industry. So the director of Total, who took control of this operation in 2019, took a plane 2 days later and went to see the president and say, that is not working, right? And they suspended operations. So the whole construction of the gas, which is 20 billion of just installation on this picture, and then there's all the rest, has been suspended, right? Which is a major setback economically for Mozambique. They're hoping it'll start next year, but we'll see. It remains to be seen whether that happens. And what happened as a result is that the government first hired Paramount and Burnham, I forgot these two actually, which is a South African company and a British company. They hired them to transition out of the DAG, so to buy planes and helicopters and train the Mozambican army to use them. So basically to bring that in-house again, right? And then they severed the contact with the Dick Advisory Group. But with the attack on Palma, the government had to change tack. The pressure became enormous. The American, the French, the British, everybody said that this can't go on. You need an external intervention to help you. You can't cope. You can't defend even the LNG, which is a series, I can't remember, 10 or 20 square kilometers. And the government resisted, but eventually had to give in. So in 2021, in August, they eventually ceded and accepted a foreign intervention, which they chose would be African. So they allowed the Rwandan to come in. So 1,000 men came from Rwanda in July 2021. And the SADC, which is a Southern African Development Community, which is a group of states of Southern Africa, was also allowed to send a series of troops. And these were South African, Lesotho, from all the countries. They joined the force. The Rwandan arrived first. These are the picture at the top. On a plane, they sent special troops, just a battalion, I think it's called, who entered in action immediately. The South Africans sent a ship under the SADC. Lesotho, that's the picture here, sent some troops, as well as Botswana and a series of other countries. And from July this year, basically, now the government has the help of an international force, which is an African force to fight insurgents. And this has been quite successful. The Rwandan have been, has a very good army. That's what they claim, but that's also what they demonstrated. And they managed, as you can see in the picture at the bottom, to recapture first the town of Palma and then the town of Mocimboa da Praia, which is really key, as I was telling you, for the airport and the harbor to develop the LNG. So that has worked. They divided certain areas for the SADC, the other area for Rwanda. And the foreign troops have managed to push back the insurgent. They pushed them back into the forest. They managed to capture a series of insurgents, kill some, and capture their main bases. So it is, at the moment, a feeling that the war is actually turning in favor of the government and its allies. Although in the last 2 weeks, the Islamic State and the insurgent have managed to do a series of small attacks, and ISIS have done a lot of publicity over it. And now people are wondering whether the government has really won, as it feels very tempted to say that now we can engage in risk construction because things are good. But wars are usually fought over long term. It takes a long time to set up an insurgency. people talk, academics and analysts talk of 3 years to set up an insurgency to run properly and 10 years to unmake it, right? The government has not killed any leaders yet, or not the main ones. They caught bases, they caught material, but there's still a lot of work. Basically, the area of Cabo Delgado is deep forest. This is where Frelimo actually fought its liberation struggle, so they know the area very well. And it is very difficult terrain to fight in the forest, where you can't actually operate with your helicopter because there's no visibility, etc. So we'll see how things go, but for sure the situation has improved over the last 6 months, and is a feeling of optimism on the part of government and its partners, but we'll see how that goes. So let me conclude here, just to actually, before concluding, I should have said that the foreign troops came for months officially, right? Both Rwandan and SADC troops, but then within a month they renewed it. And the statement by the president of Rwanda and the SADC force is that we'll stay as long as we need to stay, right? So they're not planning on going away. But at the same time, what they have started doing with actually the American, the EU, the Portuguese, is to help train the army and rebuild the Mozambican army. So there's training special forces. The Portuguese are training terrestrial, I think, special forces. The American are doing the maritime one, and the Rwandan are now training a special force whose aim would be to take over when the Rwandan leave. So there is an organization to rebuild the army, so that the foreign troops can leave. But again, this might take quite a bit of time, as the Minister of Defense himself admitted. So let me conclude to say that the conflict started very small, but like all conflict, they grow. They're still actually operating in a small area, but there's a lot of concern they may spill into Tanzania. There've been a series of attacks in Tanzania just across the border. They could spill in other provinces where these refugees are now. So there's still a lot of concern as to what might happen. I was telling you, take 3 years to start an insurgency, probably 10 to finish it on the side of the government. So we should not celebrate, I think, too soon. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. The conflict now is in full mode, I suppose, and we'll see how it evolves. But I would say there's 3 scenarios you could lay out in fairly simple fashion. The first one is the optimistic one, thinking that the Rwandan, the SADC, and I showed you, I think, the South African, right, who brought the ship. So there's quite substantial means being deployed to defeat this insurgency. But the insurgency, so it may be defeated, as the government is hoping, right? So maybe within 1 year, 2 years, they manage to reduce the potency and reduce the territory they're operating. And the Rwandan are definitely a good fit. The SADC is a traditional ally of Mozambique. So there's reason to be hopeful, not least, I suppose, because all Western donors or countries and African countries on the side of Mozambique. This is a global war. This is how now the government presents it. And a lot of means are being put in the government to help them. So intelligence, surveillance, etc. A lot of things we don't know about are being probably used to help the government to succeed in defeating the insurgents. Pessimists might say, well, it's all nice, but you know, the insurgents have the Islamic State on their side, and they're basically men on foot. They don't have cities to run. They did actually run one city for a year, but they don't run a city. They don't really have to run an operation, and it's a guerrilla, so they can shrink and move and etc. So they could, and this is really a concern, they could be tactical and not stay in that territory of Cabo Delgado and move into Tanzania. They could try to connect to the Congo, and they could move to different places. It is not easy for an insurgency to establish itself. They need to find food, they need to find support and not be denounced, etc. So their mobility is probably limited, but there are areas south of Cabo Delgado and into Tanzania where they certainly could expand, and this is a risk. So you may squeeze them in one place and they may just flee and restart the conflict elsewhere, right? So they could expand into Tanzania, they could gain more force, not least because they have the support of the Islamic State who gives them advice. So they could expand and the conflict could get out of control if the Mozambican Islamic State manages to connect to the Congo, then we're into a serious problem, right? So that would be the pessimistic scenario, I suppose. My own take, as maybe usual, is in between. I think what we probably will see is a situation like you have in Nigeria. And the comparison, I didn't say that, but the comparison with what is happening in northern Nigeria is quite interesting, both in terms of how the conflict started, but also how the government response has been partly successful, but not wholly successful. And I suspect what we may have is a conflict which eventually stabilizes in some form, gets changes in shape because of the external foreign intervention, but which may last. The insurgent may move into parts of Tanzania and operate in other areas. And I fear that what we might have is a conflict which lasts for many years, a rotten conflict. The gas industry has a capacity to adapt, so they probably will restart. There is a discussion that maybe the Rwandan will protect the area where the LNG is being developed, or maybe some private company, and then they could restart their gas development. And that would satisfy the government to an extent, but that would not resolve the insurgency. So there's a risk the insurgency continues, changes forms, and then lasts for a couple of years in the game of cat and mouse, I suppose. And I think this is the most probable scenario. What I did not say, and I'll conclude there, is, and that was implicit in my original section of the presentation, is that the insurgents are local, right? They came, a lot of them from Mocimboa da Praia, the majority is Mozambican. This is what the latest information that the SADC has been giving us as a result of material they seized from the insurgents. So it is local, it is people who are building on local grievances. And I think to resolve the conflict, not only do you need to defeat the insurgency, but you need also to undo some of these grievances and resolve this social problem which they tapped into. So it's probably quite a long process ahead of us. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll take questions, I think, if that is the case.
So I'm just going to remind everyone that if you wish to ask a question, please just come to the microphones here at the front so that everyone in the audience, the virtual audience, can hear the question as well as the answer.
Hi, Professor. I'm Nilson da Silva. I'm a student in the PhD program in Luso-Afro-Brazilian Studies. And first of all, congratulate you for this wonderful presentation. And my question to you is, you had mentioned that the age group of the participants of the movement they were mostly young. My question to you is, how was the outreach process among those members? And considering that in Tanzania, they speak Swahili, and in Mozambique, specifically in the area where they have started, they use Bantu languages. So there is a very close similarity with Swahili. So do they have some kind of expectation of enhancing the number of members regardless of the difficulty of communication, for example?
Okay, should I take another question, or? I think it'll take two at a time, that might be more.
I very much enjoyed your presentation. One comment and maybe a couple of questions. Afghanistan, Vietnam remind us that it's very difficult to defeat an insurgency. From what the government has done so far, much of it has been the stick, the use of the stick. Have they made any efforts to use the carrot to try to address some of the grievances, create jobs, bring in investments, build schools, to deny the insurgents recruits, more or less? Now, so question, if this is a Muslim instigated insurgency, it would be interesting to know what the religious breakout in Mozambique is. What percentage of Mozambique is Muslim? What percentage is Christian? Third, China. In the pre-colonial conflicts, the conflict that brought independence to Mozambique, China was one of the major underwriters. Is China now playing any role in Mozambique in this conflict? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic questions. I'll start with Nelson, I suppose. The youth. I'm not sure what you mean by the outreach process, whether it's the government, whether it's insurgency. But as I was saying, there's a debate over how much of an insurgency has to do with the youth frustration. And I'm among those who's a bit doubtful about the issue. I think if you look at the leaders, those we know, they tend not to be very young, or the question of what is youth is another issue, right? But socially in northern Mozambique, if you married and past 20 years old, you're not young anymore, right? But we could take a Western option and go up to 30 years old if you want to. And the problem is most of the leaders are actually probably 35, 45 years old. They were people who were quite well established. They set up these mosques, these sects in different places. They were involved in business. They were quite successful, actually. So it was not an issue of poverty. What they did, though, is recruit young men, and quite a few of them who were jobless. They gave them a job. They very often worked at markets, and these sect members, right? And it's not totally clear if all sect members join insurgency or not. That is another issue which I haven't resolved, and I don't think anybody's looking into it yet. But sect members attracted these youth, so the sect leaders were working in markets. They were into trading, all of them, I think. And they attracted young men who didn't have a job, didn't have a wife, and then they attracted them by giving them a job, precisely, selling in a market, and married them within the sect, right? So they were accomplished in that way. And of course, they attracted quite a lot of youth in that way. And as always in a war, it is usually youth which is fighting. So a lot of fighters are fairly young. They trained, they kidnapped and trained kids now. So we have an age of fighters which is going, I'm not too sure what from, but very young. And we haven't seen great numbers of them, but one or two, and I think a lot will come. But people who are probably around 20 to 30, so fairly young. So does that make it a youth movement? I'm not convinced. I mean, the government has mostly young men in the army. Does that make a youth army? I don't think so either, right? It is a government army. But it is an issue, and I think it needs to be researched more properly. And I think that was maybe your question as well, or yours. Something needs to be done with the youth so they don't get attracted to that option when they don't have a job, when they feel frustrated, etc. So it is an important issue and something where the government needs to do something, and it is actually, this is one of their concern. I'll come back to that. The Swahili vs Bantu issue is an important one. The stretch of land, which I showed you where the insurgency is happening, is historically Swahili. I'm not sure it's predominantly Swahili, but this is where Sultanate was established before the Portuguese arrived, right? So Swahili Sultanate in these precise areas. The historical, people who see themselves as the owners of land are mostly Swahili, right? Mwani in this case. And they have, oddly enough, under the Portuguese, as well as after independence, have been marginalized. So since the end of the Sultanate, they really have lost the prestige. They used to be the aristocracy of the land. And then from the mid-19th century, they declined. And after independence, they declined even more as the Christian brothers, the Makonde, actually reached into government, controlled the army, and did very well. And that translated in very concrete things of getting land. So the Makonde would get lands, and then a place like Mocimboa da Praia, which I showed you on the map, is actually a communal city where you have neighborhoods which are Christian Makonde and other neighborhoods are Muslim, etc. So tensions have been building for a long time. It is possibly a difficulty for expanding insurgency, and that's something I was thinking of, but they seem to, by force, making inroads into territories which are not traditionally Swahili. But I think the core still will, their social base, if there is, and I'm not saying Swahili are their social base, elements within the Swahili society may support them, which is totally different, right? But I think this is probably the territory where they feel more at ease, because it is, Swahili is a Muslim, of course, and this is probably why they, if they expand seriously, they probably get into Tanzania, because there's a historical continuity. And that border which was established between the German and the Portuguese is artificial, right? The society has been operating across the borders for many, many years, and this is still the case. The question about the stick and the carrot is another very good question, and that was partly what I was saying. The government has been criticized, if not accused, for not doing enough or not doing anything in relation to the carrot. I am of those who think that they did a few things, but not enough, which is a nuance, which is an important one. The government did co-opt some Mwani who were marginalized, some Mwani leaders. It did build one or two schools in strategic areas, but it doesn't talk about it. So the government does not talk about this kind of operation they're doing. This being said, they need to do a lot more. They need to, as you were saying, create jobs, build new schools, etc., etc. And last year or year and a half, they decided to create a major organization called ADIN, which is the Agency for the Integral Development of the North of Mozambique. So they were hoping to get hundreds of millions to precisely develop the north of Mozambique to prevent radicalization or the spread of the insurgency. The organization is slow to start, but the idea is precisely to create jobs, do trainings, offer means to do agriculture, etc., etc. And I think a lot of foreign governments are putting pressure and putting money, actually, to do exactly that. So it is kind of integral development, and then there's a more technical combating violent extremism stream, which is kind of a more narrow, trying really to combat the spread of what is called extremist ideology and targeting youth, etc. And there's a series of organizations who are very keen to do that. So it's not very clear what the government, or it's kind of clear, but it hasn't really happened yet, what the government will do and what private sector or foreign organization might do still. And I think this is something I hope they will invest a lot more in the future. And that was the conclusion I came to, I think, today, saying that this is really the area, if they want to shorten the war, they need to invest significantly in. The Muslim population of Mozambique is about 25%. Numbers are contested, and with reason, I should say. They're tricky. But the Muslim population is in the north of Mozambique, and it's mostly the coast. So I don't have the map here, but the province of Niassa and Cabo Delgado, and then the coast going down to Nampula, is where the majority of the Muslim population is. And Cabo Delgado is, if I'm not mistaken, a majority Muslim province, but I think it's about half-half. And there's a history of Islam, which I partly did or contributed to more precisely, because other people are working as well, but I contributed 1 or 2 articles. And the Muslims were marginalized after independence, like all other religious organizations. At independence, Frelimo, the liberation movement, came into power with a revolutionary agenda in which religion did not figure. So there was a marginalization of religion. There was a phase of repression. And Islam, I've argued that in an article, was not particularly targeted, but because of preconception on the part of the government, it suffered maybe more than others, because a lot of ministers did not understand that eating pork was a problem, or wearing shoes in a mosque was an offense, etc., etc. So there's been a lot of issue there. But things changed significantly in the 1990s, and the Frelimo government has rebuilt its relationship with the Muslim community, the majority of which, and there's a whole politics of it, in which I will not go into. And concerning China, no, China is not involved as far as I know. China is mostly doing economics in Mozambique, building roads, giving loans, etc., etc. But as far as I know, they're not involved and possibly not interested really in the conflict. But there is an informal economy and a criminal economy in Cabo Delgado and Niassa around illegal logging of wood, for example, or precious stones, in which some Chinese elements are involved. So not the government, but you can find a Chinese element there. We're asking you to walk, I'm sorry.
Can you say something more about the military engagement of Europeans? You mentioned, in particular, you mentioned American training of maritime, and the British and the French. Can you say some more about that and about foreign aid and military training?
Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. My name is Bridget Tibo. I'm a professor of history, African history specifically. So I enjoyed your talk, and I'm fascinated by the way you look at conflicts in Africa, especially Mozambique. And I want to agree with you that those insurgencies seem to be recurrent on the African continent. What caught my attention was something that you said about that war in Mozambique being a global war. And my question is, what makes some insurgencies global and others perceived as local? Because between the military coups d'etats in Africa, or conflicts arising from disgruntled young people, or grievances, local grievances, as well as others that are influenced by the West in terms of protecting resources that they want to exploit. We look at the case of Mali recently. We see right now Cameroon is at war with the English-speaking regions. And in terms of military coups, Chad lost their leader to a military coup. Guinea did the same thing. And so we see that there's a lot of grievances that citizens of many of these African countries have. And so what makes African leaders, in your opinion, choose to deliberately not do the right thing? And secondly, what criteria is used for some wars to be global, meriting foreign intervention, and others are ignored? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question as well. Yes, so the EU, United States, and Portugal. As I say, the foreign community was very keen on helping the Mozambican government, and the Mozambican government resisted for a long time. They accepted eventually the EU, the USA and Portugal, and maybe the British, I'm not 100% sure, to help in a training, which seems to be, I think, an easy way to accept and reduce the pressure from foreign countries without allowing them to get boots on the ground. The Mozambican government has long experience of war, Frelimo government, and they're very concerned of having foreign troops, and they resisted for 3.5 years. And it wasn't specifically European. They were quite wary of Zimbabwean, Tanzanian, who intervened in civil war, and that did not always go very well. So they really tried as much as possible to keep foreign troop away. And the easy way to do that is to accept that foreign government come and train your troops. They train them somewhere very far from the area where the conflict is happening, and then they go, right? So the American did one session, maybe a second one. Portuguese sent quite a few soldiers, but they've been related to the army for quite a while. And then you can segment them and keep everything under control. And I think it's a very sensible option. I think this is helps the Mozambican government, it helps technically the army, and having foreign troops, European and American in particular, would actually help the insurgent to claim this is a global war. And I'll come back to that point, Bridget, yes. I'll come back to that point, but it would help a narrative, which I think the insurgent as well as some people would really like to have that narrative over what you may understand as local conflict. Eventually they accepted Rwanda, and there's some politics around that, and the SADC, which is basically all the countries around, and there was huge pressure because Tanzania is across the border and they have to do something. They don't want the insurgency getting to their country. Malawi was very worried as well, and they started putting troops at the border. There was a lot of concern, and South Africa was concerned because some radical Muslim in South Africa seem to have joined the insurgency, and they is concerned that, of course, they could come back and create problems in South Africa. So the SADC, the Southern African community, put massive pressure to intervene. And eventually it was accepted because the situation became out of control. But I think the government would rather not have them if they could. Foreign aid is a bit the same story, is the government needs it, because now if you have 1 million people to feed, this is a major logistical issue, and then they have to rebuild schools. I think there's about 200 schools which have been destroyed, if not more, and different facilities. And insurgents destroy cell phone towers, they destroy electricity, they've destroyed a lot of things, which you may see just as a distraction or maybe a military tactic. I won't pronounce myself, but you need to rebuild it. And the government then have to find the money for that. So of course, foreign aid is welcome. And it has been mostly the UN organizations, so the food program and the refugee program, etc., and different organizations like the International Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, etc. There's a series of them, but not that many. I think a lot more would have liked to come, and the government has been quite selective, trying again to keep under control the influx of aid and organization. And I think the first 1 or 2 years, it was particularly tense, with some organization who wanted just to go and help, right, and just drive into the bush. And the government said, no, you know, that's not how it works, and you have to work through us, etc. So it's been a long process. But I think the UN now is probably the main organization really doing the help. And then there's finances being channeled. And this military intervention by the SADC in Rwanda is of course very expensive, and there's a lot of suspicion that eventually the American and the European will finance it and pay the government to actually cover the military cost. It's been denied, but now signs are becoming clear, and I think within a couple of months it probably will happen in one way or another, whether it's directly or indirectly. They will compensate Rwanda for the effort and the SADC. Professor Tebo, is it a global war? This is a matter. The government in Mozambique for the last year has changed its tack. We are not doing with evildoers anymore. We're not with bandits. Now we are with an external threat which came into Mozambique to destabilize us. And I think yesterday the Minister of Foreign Affairs was talking to some donors or the UN, I can't remember exactly, and they're saying, it's a global war, you need to help us. Because it is global, it's not my problem, it's yours as well. So the discourse has changed, and there is, you know, different interests as to why you want to characterize it as a global war. And I think it is global for certain audiences and not global depending on who you talk to and who they talk to, not only the government. The Americans have been pushing the narrative that it was Islamic State moving into Mozambique, and they pushed quite strongly in that direction. And there was a lot of suspicion, not least among some politicians in Mozambique or former politicians, thinking that American wanted to get boots on the ground and finally get a stronghold in Mozambique, maybe a base, a military base. And there's a very interesting port just south of the area where the insurgency is taking place, which is a deepest port on the whole coast of East Africa in Nacala, which everybody would like to control because you can bring in submarines and take them out and nobody can see it. So both the Russian and the American have been vying to get control of that, and the Mozambican since independence have managed to keep them at bay. So there's all sorts of interest, I think, as to why you may want to characterize it. And the insurgents want to characterize it as not only a global war, but a civilizational one. It is the impious Christian world, secular world against the righteous Muslim Islamic State, who's going to build a state which is under following the Sharia rule and the Quran, and who will be just, and it's very millenarian, but they do believe in it, and they think it is not a war for Mozambique. They're not interested in Mozambique per se. They want to do revolution across the globe. And the question goes down eventually to the insurgency, and I don't think we know the answer, is whether it is really just local grievances and they want to resolve their problems. So some journalists say, oh, give them a bit of money and that'll be the end of it, or co-opt a few and that'll be over. Is that all it is, a few disgruntled people, or is it something bigger, maybe regional? Maybe they want to build a Swahili sultanate or caliphate across Africa, and it's a Pan-African Muslim idea. Or maybe they do adhere fully to the international global jihad. I'm not sure, and I suspect that different people within insurgency and different leaders will have different ideas. There were rumors, and we don't really know, that there were disagreement, for example, over the relationship of the insurgency to the Islamic State. I'm not sure what makes a good leader or a leader make the right thing, not the right thing. I wish I knew and I could give the answer, but it is a question I share with you, and one which is of great concern. There's a lot of grievance, and I think indeed if some of these grievances were resolved, maybe we would get less conflict. But I should say at the same time that, of course, Africa is not the continent of conflicts. There is a lot of conflict because there's a lot of countries, and Africa is huge, right? We're talking of a massive continent. So Africa is not all about conflict, but there is a lot of conflict because there's a lot of countries and there's a lot of issues and there's a lot of poverty. And I think you're right, some better governance is definitely needed. Maybe not everywhere, but quite a bit in quite a few places.
Hello. So obviously, Dr. Navarresa, it's a little silly when we're talking this close to each other. But for the audience, I just wanted to know, My question to you is simply, when you talk about youth in this lecture, in each case, when you spoke of youth, you really meant young men. So in these regions where insurgents have established themselves, you say that they've established their own schools. Do the schools allow young girls? Is education allowed? Are women allowed to run businesses? Are they allowed to work outside of the home? Because when you look at the Islamic State and where it's established itself in other regions, that's not the case. Is it different in Mozambique?
Thank you for the question. No, it's not different, and it's not very joyful. Even within the sect, actually, so before 2017 and before the conflict, the sect members, the Al-Shabaab members, did not allow their wives to do the traditional agricultural work. So they had to wear the whole black outfit, and they were, as you saw on the picture, actually, and they had to stay at home, and in some cases they had to wear gloves, etc. So I think there were different gradation depending on the people, etc. But women would stay at home and care for the family and their husband. And what we know about insurgent bases at the moment, and there's been one or two people who stayed with them and gave testimonies, is that actually during military action, they kill most men in the fighting. They kidnap women and children. Children go to military training, boys, that is, of course, and girls and women are set on the side to be married and to look after cooking. And this is, in contrast to Western ideas, it's very regressive, but it is, the idea is to apply Sharia law in full, and women will be taught the Quran correctly if they want to. And if women don't want to learn the Quran as a Christian, then they'll become slaves. And that's the Islamic State policy, right? So there's no, there's not much hope in that area, I'm afraid.
Right, if there are no other questions, then I'd just like to take a moment again to thank everyone for being here. And in particular, I would like to thank Dr. Morier-Genoud for the interesting talk. It's the entire semester has been great having you with us. He will be talking again in December at the Whaling Museum, and the talk will focus on the Catholic Church in decolonization in Lusophone Africa. So thank you again, and have a safe drive home. Thank you.